Good afternoon and welcome to the adoption and travel impacts of teleworking. Will it be different this time? Dr. Patricia Mokhtarian. My name is Amy Luft and I am the communication coordinator at Compass. Since the 1980s, people have predicted the widespread adoption of working from home. Yet, while teleworking has seen a steady growth in the information era, overall levels have remained modest until recently, with the COVID-19 pandemic has forced its adoption on an unprecedented scale. What will happen as it is safe to go back to the office? Will managers and staff embrace the benefits of working from home, or will it be back to business as usual? Dr. Mokhtarian will offer a snapshot of the present, review past research and experience on the adoption and travel-related impacts of teleworking, and reflect on the future implications for transportation. Dr. Mokhtarian is the Susan G. and Christopher D. Pappas Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She joined Georgia Tech in 2013 after 23 years at the University of California, Davis. Prior to that, 9 years in regional planning and consulting in Southern California after completing her PhD at Northwestern University. Dr. Mokhtarian has specialized in the application of rigorous quantitative methods to the study of travel behavior for more than 40 years. A key research interest has been the impact of telecommunications technology on travel behavior. As we start, a few quick housekeeping items. First of all participants are muted for best sound quality. Please enter your questions in the chat function, and I will ask those of Dr. Mokhtarian as we wrap up today. This presentation is being recorded and will be available later on Compass's YouTube channel. Today's presentation has also been approved for 1 AICP certification maintenance credit. Watch for emails and the Compass website for information on future presentations. And now, Dr. Mokhtarian, I will stop sharing my screen and turn the screen over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Would you like for me to turn my video on or leave it off? I was already hearing some breaking up in your audio, so I'm not sure whether I should risk the video together with the screen share or not. What do you think?
Why don't you leave it off? We do have a large number on the call today, and I want to make sure we have the best sound quality that we have.
Okay, I'm getting a message that the host has disabled participant screen sharing, so I'm not able to share my screen at the moment.
You should be able to share your screen.
Let's see. Okay, let's start the slideshow. I knew that. Okay. It's coming. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Very good. Okay, here we go. Thank you very much, Amy, for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. As Amy mentioned, I've been looking at teleworking for quite a long time, really almost 40 years, in fact. And in that time, it seems like I've seen it all. So I feel like Yogi Berra with deja vu all over again. We started with Alvin Toffler in the 1980s talking about the electronic cottage. We saw the management guru Peter Drucker in the 1990s declaring that commuting is obsolete. And we saw Francis Cairncross in the mid-90s declaring the death of distance. So we've seen, for decades now, this talk of, distance has been conquered. We don't need to travel to work, etc. And then we've had all these extreme events in the meantime. Now, I'm an organizer by disposition, I guess you could say, so I couldn't resist making this typology of extreme events for which I've seen teleworking being promoted over the years. Now it's this complicated 4-dimensional typology, and you can certainly quibble with where I've ended up putting some of these events, But just to kind of walk you through it, we have the dimensions of whether the event affects home or another building versus the transportation network, whether it's planned versus unplanned, and then what is affected, the structures or humans or both, and is the root cause natural or human. So just take a quick look at these kinds of events that I've placed in the typology here, and I will give you some specific examples on the next page. Again, just very quickly to remind you that we've been seeing these kinds of things for quite a while, and in each case, I've been able to dig back in the archives and identify news items, news stories, popular media, trade press, etc., discussing the importance of teleworking during these events. So as far back as the 1984 LA Olympics, which I lived through at the time, and probably every Olympics since then, but these are just the ones that I could readily find news reports on relating to teleworking. Certainly multiple transit strikes, multiple freeway reconstruction projects, lots of earthquakes, massive infrastructure failures, times of social unrest and terrorist attacks, weather events, and of course the occasional pandemic, SARS being among the early ones in which we were already talking about teleworking during that time. So again, with every single one of these items that you see on the screen here, there was a conversation about teleworking. And by the way, it reminds me to say that at the end of the talk, I have 12 hidden slides of references, including websites and journal articles and so forth. So if anyone is as much as a data hound as I am and wanting to look back at actual sources, feel free to ask for the presentation and you'll have plenty of sources to track down there. So again, it seems like after every extreme event that history has repeated itself. Lots of people telework during the event and its aftermath. There's lots of chatter about now everybody sees how great teleworking is, so it's bound to take off rapidly from here on. And so given all those events that we've seen on the previous screen, surely teleworking must be through the roof by now, after all those decades that we've been through. Well, when you look at numbers, they're going to be all over the place because a lot depends on how you define teleworking. And even if you just say working from home, it's going to include a lot of flavors such as these, as well as the typical thing that we might think of when we say teleworking, namely salaried employees not commuting to work. Now you'll see most or all of these again on the next screen. So I'm just going to go right on to the next screen and say that from a transportation standpoint, it really matters how you define teleworking because the transportation impacts of all those different flavors differ substantially. If you're talking about salaried employees working from home, that almost certainly does reduce travel, although even that actually is disputed by some academic research, although not by me. So that's probably a good form of teleworking. But if when you say working from home, you include, I check email at home on the weekends and in the evenings, but I still go to work every day otherwise, well, that probably does nothing whatsoever for transportation. If you look at these three types of teleworking, the impacts on travel are ambiguous. It depends on the counterfactual, or what would you be doing otherwise. If the alternative is to work at a conventional job with a conventional commute, then right, probably these forms of teleworking will reduce travel. But if the alternative is not working at all, as might be the case in many situations of self-employment or moonlighting, then the job is probably generating more travel. Long distance telework is a really interesting animal because if you work at home most of the time, but take an airplane flight to your company headquarters in a different state once a month or even once a quarter, you know, from a transportation and certainly greenhouse gas emission standpoint, you're probably have a worse carbon footprint than if you commuted every day to a conventional job. And then if you want to broaden the term even more from beyond work from home specifically to telework in general, well, there are certain forms of teleworking that probably either actively increase travel or at best facilitate more travel by reducing barriers to people's willingness or ability to travel more. So it really matters how you define it. And therefore, when you see statistics like 43% of employees work remotely, or really when you see just about any statistics about teleworking, always check for what definition is being used, because the fine print really matters. And you'll see a lot of fine print on my slides here because I believe in documenting the fine print. So where do we find good, reliable statistics on how much working from home? There has been before the pandemic. The best I can tell, the most consistent year after year account of teleworkers is given by the Census or the American Community Survey Journey to Work data. And as with just about any definition of teleworking that I've seen, it kind of includes too much and excludes too much. So the question in the census is, how did you usually get to work last week? And the answers include all the familiar ways of getting to work, like drive alone, carpool, transit, walk, bike, etc., as well as worked from home. But when you think about the wording of that question, it's going to include self-employed people, which, as we saw in the preceding slide, has an ambiguous transportation impact. So we don't quite know what that means. But it's also going to exclude teleworkers, salaried employees, eliminating the commute trip, but who don't do it usually, right? So if I only telework 1 or 2 days a week or even less, then I'm not going to be counted in these figures. So again, not the most desirable definition for at least my purpose of looking at the transportation impacts, but still the best thing we have because it's asked the same way year after year for a nationwide sample that can also be deconstructed at a much finer grained geography. So what do those numbers tell us? Well, here are the US numbers for, just to keep it manageable visually, I've plotted from 2010 to 2018. We have numbers going all the way back to 1980, before which working from home was really primarily farmers and live-in domestics. But from 1980 on, we would start to see a substantial share of what we think of as teleworkers. And anyway, you can see even just for over the last 8-9 years, the work at home share nationwide has gradually increased. It's the green line there. And it's gone up. Over time, it's increased from 2.3% in 1980 to 5.3% in the most recent year for which we have good numbers. So that's an increase, fairly gradual to a present point that's not all that high, you might say. But what really startled a lot of people, including myself a couple of years ago, was the realization that nationwide, the share of working at home now exceeds the share of transit as the usual commute mode to work. Well, that's nationwide. Now, there are certainly some transit-rich cities and regions for which transit is still greater share than working from home. In Idaho, on the other hand, especially Southwest Idaho, it's the other way around, where working at home blows away transit by a factor of 10 to 30 times. And even just in isolation, the work at home share in the Southwestern Idaho region is greater than it is nationwide. I'm speculating that maybe you have a fair number of so-called lone eagle teleworkers or kind of lifestyle teleworkers who are white collar professionals, attorneys, consultants, whatever, who can work anywhere and have clients all over the country or even the world, but choose to locate in a region with high amenities. If you're the outdoors type, what better place to live, right? So that's probably one good reason, at least, why your work at home share is higher than the national average. And your transit share, let's face it, is pretty much at the bottom of the heap here across all the other transportation modes. I neglected to mention, but I think you picked up on the note in the left corner there that I've omitted, showing the drive alone share because it would dwarf everything else. So to allow us to see the other modes much more clearly, that one is not being shown here. In Idaho, Southwest Idaho, it's about 80% drive alone share, fairly stable across the years that you're seeing here. Nationwide, on the previous slide, it was close to that, about 77%. So that's giving us a picture of at least trends in working from home pre-COVID. But you might ask, well, that's nice, but still, again, even 6 to 8% is fairly modest. And after all those, discussions of all those gurus and all those extreme events, why aren't the numbers higher? And there are a lot of reasons, as you can see here. I won't go through them one by one at the moment because I'll be going through them one by one in the next series of slides. So let's look at them in turn. First of all, how many people can actually telework? And there are two kinds of studies of this question. One group of studies focuses purely on the content of the job. And those studies tend to just kind of have a listing of occupations in the US and number of people in each occupation. And some poor graduate student or undergrad goes down the list of thousands of occupations and decides, or in conference with the faculty mentor or in group conference or whatever, they agree on, well, this occupation can telework this much or whatever. And so just looking purely at really job labels and a lot of assumptions about the content of such jobs comes to the conclusion of what fraction of jobs in the US today can be teleworked. So you'll see the range of numbers here from 37% to 56%, but general ballpark, close to a half, a third to a half, depending on how you look at it. Now, the other type of study that looks at how many people can work from home tends to just ask people, can you work from home? What a concept. And when you do that, you're getting not just the job content question, but also, am I allowed to by my employer? Of course, those two things are related. If my job is not well suited, then my employer is probably not going to allow me to, but in many cases, the job is suitable, but the employer does not allow it. So for obvious reasons, then these numbers are substantially lower than the ones based purely on the job alone, because again, they're taking into account management willingness or willingness. So that's about how many can work from home. The obvious question now is how many did work from home before the pandemic. We've seen one data point, if you will, on that, the 5.3% in the 2018 Census or American Community Survey numbers. Here are two other nationwide, large sample, weighted to be representative kinds of surveys. So again, I present them to you just to show you that there's not a single, only right answer to this question. As the saying goes, the person with one watch always knows what time it is, but the person with two watches is never sure. So we have three watches here and we're not sure what time it is, but the numbers are, again, generally in the lowish range, and at least some of them can be consistent if you look under the hood at what the actual definitions are. So that's pre-COVID, but obviously a lot more people are doing so now than ever before. And so what numbers do we have on that? Here are several polls that were done, either very large scale or reliable polling services. So I am trying to focus on the most reliable data out there, although on the next slide I'm going to make an exception and give you kind of an industry poll. But for the most part, I'm focusing on research think tanks or reputable polling agencies who don't have an obvious agenda or promoting a certain outcome, if you will. So again, the numbers range, but they're fairly logical. 40% in the early part of the shutdown, if you will, as high as 62%, but that number was clearly asked, have you ever worked from home during the pandemic? So that's going to include a lot of people who may have done it a time or two, but are not doing it regularly. So probably a good number of how many people are doing it usually, if you will, to kind of use the census language, is probably around 50%, that middle number there. So that's a heck of a lot higher than the 5.3%. So clearly a lot more people are doing it now, and that's no surprise to anybody. But, you know, today's teleworking adoption, if you will, is clearly including a lot of involuntary teleworking. So nobody asked us whether we wanted to work at home. They just said, we're closing the office, go home, right? So how many people really want to telework? A lot of people seem to think that, oh, everybody wants to telework. And indeed, they may be right in a general sense that there is a high level of preference for working from home. At least, again, these are surveys taken from people who are in a position to respond to surveys in the middle of a pandemic. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt. But again, we do see high fractions of people. Now, again, fine print, I want to stress 59% of those who worked at home during the pandemic. So again, even if that's only half the workforce, then you got to cut these numbers in half if you want to try to project up to what will be happening in the workforce as a whole. But still, large fractions. I am including this poll, even though it was an industry poll, and at that only of full-time office workers working in companies who employ more than 100 employees. But I'm including it, first of all, because the graphic is so pretty, and secondly, because they do drill down. It's one of the relatively small number of surveys that drills down into how often do you want to work from home? And that's certainly a relevant question, again, from the transportation standpoint. So among people who, you know, answered this survey, more than half, again, similar kinds of numbers, wanted to work at home at least some of the time, 1 day a week or more. 30% wanted to do it, quote, most of the time, or usually, that is 3 or more days a week. Only 12% wanted to do it all the time, but hey, you know, altogether, that's still a pretty high amount of teleworking that people say they want to do. Now, here's another industry poll that I present to you primarily to kind of express my puzzlement over the way some of these polls are worded or what they really mean. Because here's a case where 54%, so again, more than half, you know, want to work from home primarily. This is after the pandemic has passed. So, but again, only among those who are currently working from home. What do you want to do afterwards? Well, half of them or a little more want to primarily work from home afterwards. 75%, gosh, 3/4 want to work from home occasionally after they no longer have to. And yet then, why do fewer than 40% feel strongly that their employer should provide opt-in remote work options when returning to normal operations? So I can't quite put that together with the allegedly high preference for teleworking. But again, that's what it says. So it does make me wonder, though, these and other kinds of studies and statistics, how soft the expressed preference for teleworking might actually be. I think a lot of people, if you ask, do you want to, it's easy to glibly say, oh yes, I want to. But when push comes to shove, an individual may realize, yeah, I know I really probably shouldn't. I'm not that motivated if I'm all by myself at home. Or, well, home is such a distracting place to be. I know I really wouldn't be productive if I had to do it all the time. So we did a study way back last century, admittedly, but we asked people who could telework and who actually wanted to telework. And when I say could, I mean, not just the job was suitable, but also the managers were willing. So could in just about the most appropriate sense you can imagine. And so among those who could and wanted to said they actually do want to telework, only 37% of that group actually did telework. So again, it's pretty striking. And of course you ask ourselves why. If you want to and you can, why aren't you doing it? And there are probably a number of constraints that aren't quite as harsh as to make them say, I'm not allowed to, I'm not able to. But again, when push comes to shove, the constraints were actually preventing them from working. And we'll see some of those in a moment. So another question is, how often do people telework? And I've got the data mostly from pre-pandemic days. The slide's going to be pretty busy, so I'm kind of revealing it to you a little bit at a time. Some of our earlier studies asked this question, not for obvious reasons. And again, it was striking that the typical average in those earlier studies was 1 or 2 days a week. So even when people say they want to telework, they don't want to do it most of the time. Most of the people, again, some do, that's fine, but we're talking general trends here. So I wanted to get some more recent data, and the best recent data I could find is from this American Time Use Survey that was taken in, well, they do it every year as I understand, but this particular couple of years they had a module on the leave and job flexibilities. And so asked people in these particular 2 years about working from home. And they have this concept of exclusive work at home, and what that means, or I'm calling it exclusive work at home, but the wording was, you know, did you work exclusively at home? And the idea being, if you worked at all, you know, was it only at home? So somebody could say, I work exclusively at home today, even if they only worked 1 hour, but that 1 hour was at home and they didn't work anywhere else, right? So that kind of language, again, it excludes things I would want to include, and it includes things I would want to exclude. So you can see how it's not the perfect definition, as it never seems to be. But when you look at all of that and try to do some back of the envelope calculations, then the best I could tell, the average frequency of teleworking in this time frame was 1.7 days a week. So right in that 1 to 2 days a week window, if you will, that we had seen consistently in earlier studies, and computes out to somewhere around 5% of the non-self-employed workers working only from home on any given weekday. I was trying a little bit when I came up with those numbers to screen out possible weekends, which are technically included in the definition that they used. So again, it's a little bit of a mushy number, but something like that, right? So again, the implication is that even when people want to do it, then they don't want to do it all the time. So it indicates to me that there's an optimum level of telecommuting, and that optimum level is going to differ from person to person. Again, there's plenty of evidence of people who've worked full-time for years and love it. But then there seem to be a lot of other people who like working from home, but only a certain amount. There was one interesting study that related job satisfaction to the amount of time or number of days that people teleworked, and found that job satisfaction plateaued around 2 days a week, or 15 hours a week of teleworking. So again, that number keeps popping up, and the idea being that beyond that, it certainly didn't increase job satisfaction. And you know, where that satisfaction peaked or plateaued differed by job and person, but the average was around that. So again, it just suggests that we need to temper our expectations and ask a lot of questions, not just do you want to telework, but how much do you want to telework? And then there's the question of how long did people telework? So one of the things we noticed in our earlier research was that many teleworkers didn't seem to stay teleworkers for very long. So here's 3, early studies from the 1990s in which the basic results were a few months into the pilot project, or after the end of the 2-year pilot project, you've lost a big chunk of the teleworkers who started. Now, as far as I know, people haven't done much with this since then, and so I do think it's an under-researched question that's well worth investigating further. My own takeaway from that was that there's a lot of churn in the number of people who are actively teleworking at any given point in time. I like to use the analogy of the bucket. And so we keep pouring more teleworkers into the top of the bucket, meaning more and more people have adopted teleworking as time goes on, but there's a hole in the bottom of the bucket, and the teleworkers are leaking out the bottom, perhaps almost as fast as they're being poured in at the top. hence the gradual increase in teleworking, but only gradual increase over time. But one interesting thing was that we asked people in our studies, why did you stop teleworking? And, it was reassuring that for the most part, it was not because, after I tried it, I realized I can't stand it, or I'm just not good at it, I can't do it. But rather it was constraints. My job changed, my manager changed. In some cases, I only intended to do it temporarily to start with, as a transition back from maternity leave into the regular workplace or whatever. But in most cases, it was not because of preferences. However, I need to caveat that a little bit with noting that for several of these official formal pilot projects, we saw a lot of people dropping out before they even started, if you will. And by that, I mean they had expressed a preference for teleworking, they signed up to do it, they took training because, again, in those early days, everybody was really worried about how to do it and, are they really going to be working? And let's tell them how to do it. And so they took the training and then never started teleworking afterwards. So it suggests that maybe the training served a purpose of maybe helping them realize that they weren't cut out for it. Of course, maybe the reporting burdens were sufficiently onerous that they decided it wasn't worth it under those circumstances. But it's also quite possible that they were doing some self-introspection during that training period and realizing that maybe they would not be successful at it after all. So even the numbers you're seeing here of attrition are only after what may have been a sizable amount of attrition even before joining the program, so to speak. So, I mean, maybe some of you are asking, again, why doesn't everybody want to work from home? Because it's so great. And I think you've all probably thought of these advantages. You can certainly read them faster than I can read them out loud. And again, nothing particularly new here. So lots of good reasons to telework. And again, these would certainly account for the high level of preference that we have seen. On the other hand, you've also probably all been thinking about and experiencing and or hearing people talk about some of the downsides of working from home. And so it's certainly also not a surprise to me to imagine that for many people, it's not their preferred way of work, or if it is, 1 or 2 days a week will do me, thank you very much, and I don't need to be doing it all the time. And you can make a similar set of arguments for managers. There's tons of reasons why managers should want to do it. And, many telework consultants have marveled over the years at, why hasn't it taken off more? Even from the employer side, it should be in their obvious best interest in many cases for these kinds of reasons. But again, on the other hand, there are some downsides, right? And so consistently, studies have shown that management resistance is still the strongest barrier to teleworking increasing. And I have to say, and it's not just me, the literature and many studies and even real world executives, are backing up the idea that it's really hard to beat the value of in-person communication. And that includes the synergy, the serendipity of face-to-face interaction, building and sharing the tacit knowledge that's been shown to be important to innovation. It's extremely valuable, and really no amount of video conferencing can replicate it. And so many organizations say, it's just too important. That kind of benefit to us is too important to forego. And then there is a certain amount of overhead associated with remote management. And again, lots of companies have decided the benefits of that, of the dispersed workforce, are worth the cost. But others may have equally reasonably come to a different conclusion. Now, I have to say that some of the reasons managers don't want their staff to work from home are not necessarily the strongest ones. One that we always hear is, how will I know they're really working? And of course, the immediate rejoinder is, how do you know they're working in the regular office? Most information work is not widget-like, where you can count the number of widgets being produced at the end of the day. So you're already judging your employees' information work on its quality, quantity, timeliness, and is there any reason why you cannot apply those same judgments to work done from home? Also, what we hear sometimes is, well, you know, I really trust Susie to do it. She's fantastic and I don't have any concern whatsoever. Joe, on the other hand, you know, I'm not sure about him. He probably would just goof off and so forth. But, you know, it's just going to be too much of a hassle to tell Susie she could do it, but then have to tell Joe why he can't do it. So I'll just not let anybody do it. That's the simple solution. And, you know, the rejoinder is that in theory, managers make differential assessments of their employees all the time. They tell one employee that you're excellent and another employee you need improvement. On the other hand, those judgments are not always public as, yeah, Susie's able to work from home, why can't I? So many managers kind of shrink from such confrontations and just decide that it's easier not to let anybody do it than to have to let some people do it, but defend why other people can't do it. So understand, but won't it be different this time? After all, you know, everybody's been having to do it now, and even managers who might have resisted before are somehow making it work. Well, remember how the talk started? I mean, we have heard this before, and I think I could be forgiven for a little bit of skepticism about how different this time might be after so many other times of it's going to be different this time. Well, but technology is so much better now, we hear, and it is, absolutely, and it'll get even better. But, you know, then we have examples of companies like Yahoo and Reddit and IBM. Those are pretty high-tech companies, and they had teleworking programs in some cases for years and had celebrated cutbacks and or elimination of the entire program for the kinds of reasons that we just talked about, you know, the value of face-to-face communication and so forth. So I would suggest that some of the key reasons for the slow adoption of working from home that we've seen for decades now have really not gone away, and in fact are fairly robust and stubborn, if you will, long lasting. So my own take on it is that, you know, it's not going to be a case of, no, we're going to snap right back to the status quo ante, but nor will it be a case of, oh, it's all different now and, you know, suddenly this changes everything. Rather, you know, the reality is going to be somewhere in between those two extremes. So I can always hear people thinking, well, duh, I could have said that, you know, what's the innovative insight here? So I don't want you to think I'm trying to cop out. I'm actually quite willing to go on the record like this and suggest that the post-pandemic bump that we will probably see in the amount of teleworking going on a regular basis afterwards will tend to be toward the low end of the spectrum for all of the reasons that we've been talking about. However, I stress that even a bump at the low end of the spectrum is going to be quite a bit better off than we were before. You know, it wouldn't take much, you know, if current amounts of teleworking are pretty much 10 times the normal levels, then even if they only double, you know, that's not a big change from, you know, the outer extreme of where we were during the pandemic, but it's still a substantial change over where we were before the pandemic. So in other words, even relatively small changes in a proportional sense can end up being quite large relative to the status quo ante. So just want to wrap up and give hopefully time for some questions now. We used to ask how to increase the adoption of teleworking. You know, lots of transportation demand management agencies and transportation policymakers and planners spent lots of time and energy thinking about how can we get people to adopt teleworking. Well, guess what? You know, a pandemic has pretty much taken care of that for us these days. Now, arguably under less than ideal circumstances, with kids running underfoot and two spouses under the same roof, both trying to video conference at the same time, etc. But, you know, we have had by now several months to adjust to this reality and certainly have a sense of what it would be like to do it in more normal circumstances. So I'm just eager to see what does happen 2-3 years from now. Where will we be? The census data will give us a pretty good snapshot of that. And so you can think back to this talk and see whether Pat's probabilistic prediction came true or not. So just to close, I'm an academic, I do research, so of course I have to have a list of research needs. This is just things that immediately come to my mind. There are numerous other questions that are of interest, but these are some that particularly intrigue me at the moment. And just my last comment is to not forget those whose jobs are not well suited to teleworking, or whose managers can't do it, aren't willing to let them do it, or really whose home situations may not be conducive, may not have great internet access at home. So there's always going to be people for whom teleworking is not feasible. And I know some jobs, simply have to be done on site, and that's all there is to it. But in most office environments, even jobs that largely have to be done on site, there may be flexibility that can be offered in terms of temporal flexibility, if not spatial flexibility, or job sharing, such that part of a job that's shared with someone else can be done remotely. So I think those of us who have been working at home for the past several months have realized very vividly how fortunate we are that we still have jobs, that we are still able to work reasonably productively. And so I hope that those in decision-making positions will think about how to be as flexible as possible for those who don't have that same privilege. So that's my talk, and I will, oops, what did I do? I hope I didn't. Oh, I'm still screen sharing. So now I'll stop sharing and.
Okay, Pat, I have a couple of questions for you from the chat. The first question is, what does the research show regarding the development of new employees in environments that emphasize telework?
Right, that's a good question. And again, I think it can be difficult. A lot of companies, though, are doing it, no question about it. There are distributed organizations, and so everybody is teleworking. So, I'm not an organizational behavior person. I'm a transportation person, so I'm not immersed in that literature. But I do know that organizations who operate that way have evolved ways of welcoming new employees to the organization, helping them get acquainted with others, building that tacit knowledge, that social capital, et cetera, that you need. So it can work, but keep in mind that people who join such organizations where they're distributed to start with are self-selected to help make it work, if you will. So what worries me a bit is the involuntary teleworking that we all have to do now under crisis mode. But I would be a little concerned if companies start saying, and after the pandemic, everybody still has to work from home, because I feel like if you didn't sign up for that to start with, it's a recipe for a lot of unhappy employees, and potentially, again, there could be domestic violence issues or substance abuse issues, or, other things that are pretty serious that you would be kind of forcing an employee to be subjected to or quit their job when in fact that wasn't what they bargained for at the beginning. So it's one thing to, join a company where you understand from the beginning that that's the way it works. It's another thing to kind of the rules change in midstream.
And another question. It seems that all of the previous examples are region or city-specific triggers. Do you think that the fact of this pandemic being tied to a global issue would change your prediction of little or no change to pre-pandemic levels?
That's a great question. I guess my immediate reaction is we still experience things locally. So we're experiencing what it's like to telework in much the same way, whether it's a region scale extreme event or a global one. Of course, what could be different is that, you know, everyone's looking around and realizing that lots of people are doing it all over the world, and companies, employers are looking around and saying, hey, you know, it could be normative. So, you know, that's certainly a factor. And, you know, I hadn't given that particular question a lot of thought, but I would say that yes, if I were looking at a regional extreme event rather than a global one, the bump on my probabilistic prediction would be even farther to the left, right? So I would assume that we would bounce back even closer. And we have lots of evidence for that. I mean, again, even you know, after the Olympics, right? People were willing to work from home a couple of weeks, but not forever, et cetera. So again, I think when the local impact is short-lived and relatively contained or localized, then so too will be the you know, longer-term impact. So I think the longer-term impact will be larger here, but my guess will still be you know, not very far toward the right end of that spectrum.
Next question. Any insight into changes to work schedules, such as starting earlier or later, or splitting days between in-person and teleworking? Thinking about the impact to the peak travel challenges in single occupancy vehicles.
Great question, and that's really another what I would consider understudied aspect of teleworking. I mean, you've already seen some of the definitional challenges, and now add to that part-day teleworking. So really an uncounted amount of that goes on where people work from home a couple or 3 hours in the morning and then go in mid-morning and they've avoided the peak, and they may do the reverse in the afternoon, or they may work late into the evening on that side of the day. But so they still make a commute, but it's at least one leg of it is off peak. And so I would love to see, you know, more detailed study of how much of that is even going on. I don't think we have a good handle on how much is happening now. And, you know, some efforts to promote it where, again, I think it could be a very useful strategy, again, perhaps for people who either don't want to spend all day at home, or for whom it's not conducive, or again, work-family balance issues where maybe they're working at home till a kid needs to go to the doctor in the mid-morning or whatever. So I think that's a lot. There's a lot that could be done with that.
The next question is kind of a two-part, all based on shifts. Do you see shifts based on generational needs, or due to shifts such as changing workforce, such as higher share of white-collar jobs, or enabling technologies such as Zoom?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly the conventional wisdom is that as managers, as a current generation of, say, baby boomer age managers age out, so to speak, and they're replaced from below with Gen Xers and eventually millennials, digital natives, that, you know, at least that generation is going to be also comfortable with, you know, digital technology and working from anywhere and doing anything from anywhere, that surely a lot of this management resistance will fade away as we get managers from these younger generations. They might not be so younger when they become managers, but you get the picture. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. Again, I hope I'll stick around long enough to kind of observe, because again, I think a lot of those issues, both on the manager side, but also on the employee preference side, as well as constraint side, are still going to be with us, right? And so I do think there is this kind of dynamic equilibrium level of teleworking that seems to be kind of optimal, if you will. And I say dynamic because over time, again, I think that level will gradually increase, but perhaps not as fast or as high a point as some might think. Yeah, more jobs will be information loaded. Again, I think there's an irreducible minimum set of jobs that will pretty much always need to be on site, or at least, you know, I don't know forever, but it might take a while before I'll trust a robot to cut my hair or, you know, to take care of my kid or something. So I think, you know, again, technology is pushing the envelope a lot, but it's still going to take a while before we see such a wholesale change in that respect. Did I cover the question pretty much, or?
I believe so, yes. And next question, did you find in any of your pre-COVID research if private companies were more apt to make work from home work for their employees more than government agencies, or vice versa?
You're right, that's a good question. Certainly there have been high visibility private organizations adopting it, although again, in some cases, very high visibility organizations ditching it. The government has been fairly prominent in adopting it, at least, you know, from a leadership level. I think when it comes to rank and file managers, a lot of times that's where the slowdown hits. So it's one thing for the elected official at the top or the, you know, director of the agency to announce that we're going to do this, because again, it's virtue signaling, right? If you're an environmental agency or a transportation agency, you obviously need to be practicing what you preach. And I know this because I work for such an agency. I hope nobody from SCAG is on the line, but you know, SCAG, when I worked there in the early 1980s, was really not putting its money where its mouth was. And we were a transportation agency touting telecommuting as a strategy for improving congestion and air quality in the region. But it took quite a bit of jawboning to get the agency willing to have a telecommuting, even pilot project, let alone permanent work from home. So similarly, you know, at some point, you know, we've had elected officials promote it, and therefore government agencies allegedly adopt it. But when it gets to that interface between a line manager and the rank and file underneath, then there can often be roadblocks. So I don't really know offhand whether public or private were more apt to adopt it. They would probably tend to do it for different reasons. The public sector for all of those societal goods like improving transportation and reducing reliance on fossil fuels and all of that. Whereas for private companies, it would potentially more often be for bottom line reasons, that it just made good business sense. But in many cases, the private companies were virtue signaling as well. And let's hope that the government was also experiencing some bottom line benefits. So it's really, you know, mixture of motives in both cases.
So earlier you mentioned that perhaps part of the reason that Southwest Idaho had a high percentage of teleworking was, as you call it, those lone eagles, those people that can basically live anywhere and work remotely. Do you anticipate, with kind of the success that people have seen in teleworking after COVID-19, that we may see an increase in that of people either moving elsewhere or deciding to just kind of completely take that jump on their own?
I do. Again, you know, it's sort of hard to predict how much of it we'll see. Of course, I'm reading the same articles all of you are, and I feel sure there's a lot of you know, apartment dwellers who are looking to buy their first home in the suburbs because they're sick of trying, again, two income couple or two career couple trying to both work from home in a small apartment, or they want a lawn for the kids to play on, and so forth and so on. So I do think there's at least a short-term impetus for residential relocation, for companies to realize, hey, everybody's out of sight already, you know, we can hire from Idaho instead of Silicon Valley. So I don't know what your salaries are in Idaho, but probably lower than in Silicon Valley, or at least cost of living. So companies, somebody used the great word arbitrage. You know, we're going to be seeing a lot of salary or wage arbitrage across the country as companies realize they can, you know, hire fantastic programmers or whatever in the heartland instead of paying them, you know, half again as much to live in California or whatever. So I do think there will be a fair amount of reshuffling, if you will, of people trying to, you know, those same, you know, high-priced employees in Silicon Valley may be looking to move to Idaho or the Midwest or whatever. So it'll be fascinating. I do think we will see marked rearrangement of the landscape. Again, how much? You know, I don't foresee the death of cities. You know, some people have said, oh, you know, downtowns will be a ghost town and the high rises will be empty. I mean, come on. We said that after 9/11, you know, who's going to want to live in a target-rich environment like Manhattan? Well, you know, Manhattan didn't die. So I think all of these changes are very real and fascinating, arguably at the margin, and or, you know, will occur gradually over time. So
based on your experiences and knowledge of current trends, how much confidence would you have in the long-range transportation model outputs and the capital improvement programs resulting from those?
Wow, that's a loaded question. How much confidence do I have in any long-range transportation model outputs, you know, let alone coming out of a time of turmoil like this? You know, long range by definition is a dicey proposition. So I don't know what to tell you other than to look at the model early and often and, you know, do the best you can with the information you have. Try to, you know, be flexible about what you're contemplating doing so that you can be as nimble as possible when things, you know, the predictions don't pan out as planned. But, you know, at the end of the day, is it better to have models than not? I think so. You know, I think we need to try to improve them as much as we can on a regular basis. But if they didn't exist, we'd need to invent them. So let's just do the best we can with them and keep making them better. No magic answers there.
Sorry. Do you know if anyone has started collecting employee work from home life versus work satisfaction metrics? For example, depression from a lack of coworker interaction.
Right. That is an important area of research. Again, it's not one that I'm focused on on a regular basis, but I'm aware that some does go on and perhaps a lot that I'm not aware of. So I feel sure that people are looking at that very much during this season, especially and beyond. So I know I'll be doing a new survey of teleworking over the next year or so, and that's certainly the kind of question I will include in our survey. A couple of my PhD students are doing a survey themselves on commuting, so looking at kind of the value added that commuting itself brings. You know, one of my research themes has been the positive utility of travel itself. And I know if you commute in congestion, it's not the same, but many people actually do find value in their commute. It's their me time, or, you know, the only time they have to themselves all day or whatever. So my students are interested in what does commuting bring to people's well-being in normal times, and what does the absence of commuting do to their well-being during working from home. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in the question of well-being in general and well-being in relation to work in particular, and working from home even more in particular. So yeah, we'll be seeing a lot of work on that come out.
Okay, well, I have 159, and that actually was the last question that has popped up. So this seems like a perfect time to wrap up. So I want to thank you very much, Pat, for your time today and your expertise. I'm very anxious to see the results of the survey that you mentioned that you'll be working on next year and see what we learn from that. Also, thank everyone for attending. We will be following up and emailing you an evaluation. For those of you that regularly attend Compass's education series, I know every time I talk about how important those evaluations are. In this case, it is probably even more important because this is the first one that we have done as a virtual education series. And so we are very anxious to hear back from you to help us determine if this is something that we should continue to either mix in once we can get back to in person, or use exclusively, or just stick with our in-person. So I really do appreciate any feedback that you can provide us to help us plan for our future education series. So with that, again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Pat, very much for your time. We really enjoyed hearing from you, and I know I learned a lot about where things have been and where things may be going in the future. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.